Hello, my friend. Tonight we're stepping into the shadowed corners of the medieval world, specifically, its most unusual and often overlooked sexual practices. The Middle Ages are frequently painted in soft, romantic hues, knights in shining armor, chaste maidens, and candlelit cathedrals. But the truth is far stranger, far messier, and far more human than any fairy tale. Close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself walking those ancient streets. Your boots sink slightly into the mud as you weave through narrow lanes, past timber-framed houses leaning like tired old men over the road. The air carries the scent of wood smoke, livestock, and something less pleasant rising from the gutters. You hear the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant bleating of sheep, and merchants calling out their wares in a lively marketplace. On the surface, it all feels rustic, orderly, even pious. But beneath that quiet facade, hidden in castle corridors, whispered in confessionals, and tucked away in the pages of forgotten manuscripts, was a world teeming with desire, contradiction, and customs that would leave most of us blinking in disbelief. Fair warning, this journey might just shatter a few of your cozy assumptions about the past. But that's where things get interesting, isn't it? Before we go any further, if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into history's hidden corners, consider giving the video a like and subscribing, but only if it genuinely resonates with you. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always a joy to see who's tuning in from around the world. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's rather eye-opening exploration together. We often imagine the Middle Ages as a time of rigid piety and unwavering faith, and to a large extent, that's accurate. The Church held enormous influence, shaping laws, customs, and daily life. Officially, sex was a tightly controlled affair, permitted only within marriage, and even then, primarily for the purpose of procreation. Pleasure? That was suspect. Lust? A dangerous sin. From the pulpit, priests thundered warnings about the perils of the flesh and the eternal consequences of giving in to desire. And yet, here's the twist. Medieval life wasn't nearly as austere as those sermons might suggest. In fact, there was a vibrant, often contradictory undercurrent of human behavior that danced right up to, and sometimes beyond, the edges of what the Church deemed acceptable. Medieval people, much like us, seemed remarkably skilled at holding two opposing ideas in their heads at once. One eye fixed on heaven, the other quietly indulging in earthly delights. Take, for example, the penitentials, those thick, detailed manuals used by confessors to assign penance for sins. These weren't vague moral guides. They were astonishingly specific, especially when it came to sex. They listed not just forbidden acts, but exact positions, frequencies, and even the thoughts one might have during intimacy. And for each transgression, there was a prescribed punishment, often weeks of fasting on bread and water, or hours of prayer. Interestingly, some acts we might consider minor today were treated more leniently than others. Intercourse in the manner of beasts, a euphemism for anything other than the missionary position, sometimes carried a lighter penance than masturbation or coitus interruptus, which the Church viewed as a direct affront to procreation. It's almost as if these texts were less about preventing sin and more about cataloging every possible variation of it. The very existence of such detailed prohibitions suggests that medieval sexual life was far richer and more inventive than the official doctrine would have us believe. Of course, historians still debate how accurately these penitentials reflect actual behavior versus the clergy's anxieties. Were they documenting real practices or simply compiling a worst-case scenario list of everything they feared might be happening? It's a bit like modern legal codes that try to anticipate every possible infraction, just in case. Either way, the gap between religious ideals and human reality was as wide then as it is now. Now let's shift our focus to something central to medieval life: marriage. If you're picturing candlelit vows and grand declarations of love, think again. For most people, especially commoners, marriage was less a romantic union and more a practical arrangement. It was a contract, often negotiated between families, tied to land, labor, or trade. Love might grow over time, but it was rarely the starting point. Imagine being a young person in a small village. Your future spouse wasn't chosen for charm or compatibility, but for how well their family's field bordered yours, or whether their trade complemented your own. For a man, a wife meant a partner in work and childbearing. For a woman, A husband offered protection, stability, and a recognized place in society. Intimacy, then, wasn't about passion. It was a duty, a necessary part of maintaining the household and producing heirs. Even within marriage, the church imposed strict rules about when sex was allowed. Certain times of the year, Lent, Advent, major feast days, and even every Sunday, were considered closed seasons for marital relations. Picture trying to schedule intimacy around the liturgical calendar, knowing that a misstep could land you in spiritual hot water. To us it sounds absurd, like planning a date night around a sports playoff schedule. Except the stakes were your soul, and yet, despite all these restrictions, people found ways to navigate desire, duty, and doctrine. The medieval world, for all its piety and structure, was never as simple or as chaste as it first appears. But we're only just beginning to uncover what really went on behind those heavy oak doors and stone walls. If a couple had sex during those forbidden times, Lent, Advent, feast days, or even Sundays, it wasn't just a minor slip-up. It was considered a serious sin, one that demanded confession and penance. The church treated these violations as breaches of sacred law, not mere lapses in judgment. Yet historians have long debated just how strictly these rules were followed. Were they rigidly obeyed, or were they more like lofty ideals quietly ignored behind closed doors? You can almost imagine the hushed, slightly exasperated exchange in a medieval bedroom. Is it Advent already? Darn it, I just got comfortable. This tension between the church's strictures and the messy, persistent reality of human desire was a constant undercurrent of daily life. And nowhere was that pressure more intense than when it came to producing children. For the nobility and landowning classes, the need for heirs, especially male ones, wasn't just personal. It was political, economic, and existential. A wife who couldn't bear a son might find herself cast aside through divorce or annulment, or at the very least become the source of deep anxiety for her entire family line. That kind of pressure bred desperation, and, as we'll see, some truly unusual attempts to influence fertility. But even amid all the rules and expectations, the marital bed wasn't just a site of duty. It was also, surprisingly often, a place of genuine affection, companionship, and even tenderness. Don't let the rigid framework fool you. Life, love, and longing always found a way. After all, the human heart, and other parts of the anatomy, have never been particularly good at following rulebooks when passion or procreation is involved. Which brings us to a natural question. If sex was so tightly regulated and procreation so heavily emphasized, what about contraception? Surely, with limited resources, harsh living conditions, and the ever-present threat of famine or plague, people must have looked for ways to control family size. And they did, desperately. Contraception in the Middle Ages was, by modern standards, primitive, risky, and often downright bizarre. Forget pills or clinics. Medieval birth control looked more like something brewed in a witch's cauldron than dispensed by a physician. Families faced real survival pressures. Another child could mean less food for everyone, or even starvation during a bad winter. For many women, avoiding pregnancy wasn't about convenience. It was about staying alive. So what did they try? Some turned to amulets and charms. One might wear the testicles of a weasel around their neck or carry a dried mule's womb as a talisman. Others swore by savine, a plant believed to prevent conception, or drank herbal mixtures laced with animal urine. You can almost hear the nervous whisper, "Are you sure this weasel charm works, Agnes?" Because Bartholomew is getting rather enthusiastic. Beyond these folk remedies, there were also herbal concoctions drawn from medieval medical texts. Pennyroyal rue and tansy were commonly cited as contraceptives or abortifacients. Brewed into teas or potions, some of these plants did have biological effects, often dangerously so. They could induce menstruation or miscarriage, but with high risks of poisoning, hemorrhage, or death. Their reliability as birth control was spotty at best, but in a world with little understanding of reproductive anatomy, people clung to whatever seemed to offer hope. And then there were the truly magical approaches. Some believed that burying specific objects under a full moon or reciting certain incantations could prevent pregnancy. In the medieval worldview, magic and medicine weren't separate realms, they were deeply intertwined. A manuscript might list a herbal recipe on one page and a fertility spell on the next, because both were seen as valid tools for influencing the unseen forces governing life. All of this reveals something profound. Even in an age of dogma and danger, people fiercely sought control over their own bodies and futures. Their methods may seem absurd to us now, but they were born of real need, limited knowledge, and a deep belief in the hidden powers of the natural and supernatural world. Of course, while some struggled to avoid pregnancy, others were equally desperate to encourage it. This brings us to the wonderfully strange realm of medieval aphrodisiacs. Influenced by ancient Greek and Roman theories of the four humors, medieval medicine often prescribed foods and herbs to balance the body and stimulate desire, not just for pleasure, but to fulfill marital duties and produce strong offspring. The ingredients? Let's just say they weren't exactly romantic. Sparrow brains were popular based on the observation that sparrows are famously amorous. Mandrake root, steeped in myth and said to scream when pulled from the ground, was powdered and consumed for its supposed potency. Some recipes even called for animal semen or blood, believed to transfer vitality directly to the user. Picture a medieval cook grimacing as they stirred a love potion that smelled suspiciously of barnyard and regret. External applications were just as odd. Carrying a dried pigeon liver or the bone from a bat's right wing was thought to boost attractiveness or virility. Others rubbed oils made from animal fats and pungent herbs onto their skin, hoping for results that likely never came. Did any of it work? Probably not in the way they hoped. But scholars often point to the placebo effect. Belief itself can be a powerful catalyst. More importantly, these practices reflect a timeless human impulse, the desire to shape our own destinies, especially when it comes to love, fertility, and intimacy. So while these medieval date-night remedies might provoke more laughter than lust today, they speak to something deeply human. In a world full of uncertainty, people reached for whatever tools they had, science, superstition, or sparrow brains, to claim a little agency over their bodies and their lives. And honestly, when your options are that limited, even a dried bat bone might start to look promising. Perhaps the most striking thing about the medieval world is how fluid the line was between medicine and magic. There was no clear boundary, just a spectrum of practices, beliefs, and hopes, all aimed at solving deeply human problems. When it came to something as vital as ensuring the continuation of one's lineage, people were willing to try almost anything. If a dried bat wing or a potion brewed from dubious herbs promised even a sliver of hope, it was worth a shot. After all, in a time when infant mortality was high, famine was common and social standing often hinged on producing heirs. The stakes couldn't have been higher. We've already wandered through the tangled realities of medieval marriage, the pressure to conceive, the church's rigid rules about when intimacy was allowed, and the desperate, sometimes dangerous measures people took to either encourage or prevent pregnancy. But marriage and procreation weren't the only expressions of sexuality in the Middle Ages. There was another, more shadowed dimension, one that existed on the fringes of respectable society, yet was undeniably woven into the fabric of urban life. The brothel. You might assume these places were hidden away, operating in total secrecy. But surprisingly, many medieval towns didn't just tolerate brothels, they regulated them, taxed them, and in some cases even ran them outright. While the church loudly condemned prostitution as a mortal sin, city councils often took a far more pragmatic view. They saw brothels as a necessary evil, a way to channel male desire away from respectable women and maintain some semblance of public order. It was a classic case of civic realism clashing with religious idealism. In many cities, especially from the 14th century onward, brothels weren't clandestine dens but semi-official institutions. Some were even publicly owned, licensed by the town council, and subject to local ordinances. Imagine the irony. The same authorities who fined people for working on Sundays or missing Mass were collecting rent from brothels on the edge of town. It was less moral hypocrisy and more cold-eyed pragmatism. If men are going to seek this, better it happen in a controlled space than in the alley behind the baker's shop. But don't mistake this tolerance for compassion. For the women working in these places, life was harsh, precarious, and marked by deep stigma. Though their labor was quietly accepted, or even institutionalized, they were often barred from churches, excluded from guilds, and denied basic legal protections. Many cities forced them to wear distinctive clothing, striped hoods, bright gowns, or specific colors, so everyone would know who they were at a glance. This wasn't about safety or dignity. It was about containment, a way to keep sin visible but separate from the rest of society. In some larger cities, there's even evidence of rudimentary health inspections, crude attempts to check for signs of venereal disease, long before germ theory existed. Officials might examine workers or temporarily shut down a brothel during an outbreak. These efforts were basic, often ineffective, and driven more by fear of public disorder than genuine care. Still, they reveal a grudging acknowledgement that sex work had real-world consequences that couldn't be ignored, even by a society steeped in piety. So while church bells called the faithful to prayer, just a few streets over, another kind of human need was being met, under the watchful, conflicted eye of the very institutions that claimed to condemn it. It's a stark reminder that no era, however devout, is immune to the complexities of desire, survival, and compromise. And if we think brothels reveal the contradictions of medieval urban life, consider this: even those sworn to celibacy, monks, nuns, and priests, were not always immune to the pull of the flesh. Celibacy was a cornerstone of clerical life, especially after the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, which sought to purify the church by enforcing strict vows of chastity. In theory, clergy were to live entirely for God, free from marital ties or sexual relations. In practice, not so much. For centuries, many priests lived openly with wives or concubines, often raising families right in the parish rectory. In some villages, the priest's housekeeper was widely understood to be his partner, and sometimes even called a priestess by locals. Parishioners often didn't mind. They valued a priest who was present, kind, and good with children, even if he bent the rules from Rome. After all, distant bishops might demand perfection, but neighbors needed someone who'd show up for baptisms and funerals. This quiet defiance was so widespread that church councils issued endless decrees against it. Bishops on visitation tours would scold priests for keeping women in their homes, though many priests simply claimed these women were sisters or cousins, a flimsy excuse that rarely fooled anyone, especially when several children bore a striking resemblance to the local vicar. Reformers railed against clerical concubinage for generations. But human nature proved stubbornly resistant to top-down moral mandates. The truth is, the medieval clergy weren't a monolithic group of austere, otherworldly figures. Many were deeply embedded in their communities, living lives that blended the sacred and the domestic in ways that official doctrine never intended. Their struggles between duty and desire, between Rome's demands and local realities, mirror the same tensions we've seen everywhere else in medieval sexuality. A constant negotiation between what was preached and what was practiced. And now, having touched on marriage, brothels, and the complicated lives of the clergy, we come to a term that loomed large in the medieval imagination, one that encompassed far more than we might assume today. It was a word that carried the weight of divine judgment, social panic, and profound misunderstanding. But that's a story for the next part of our journey: sodomy. Today, the word might bring to mind a narrow, clinical definition, perhaps limited to specific acts between people of the same sex. But in the medieval world, sodomy was a far more expansive and terrifying concept. To theologians, canon lawyers, and moralists of the time, it wasn't just about who was involved, it was about purpose. Any sexual act that couldn't possibly lead to procreation was suspect. And if it didn't serve the divine mandate of making babies, it risked falling under the shadow of sodomy. That meant same-sex relations were certainly condemned, but so was masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, even between married couples, and intercourse during forbidden times like Lent or Sundays. The logic was chillingly simple. If it didn't align with the natural order of procreation, it was unnatural, and therefore sinful, dangerous, even heretical. The definition was so broad that it cast a long, anxious shadow over even the most private moments of married life. Imagine trying to be intimate with your spouse only to wonder, is this position allowed? Is this time of year safe? Could this be seen as against nature? Punishments for sodomy varied widely. Sometimes it was a fine or public shaming. Other times it meant imprisonment, castration, or execution by burning. The severity often depended on time, place, and who was accused. But the real danger lay in how easily the charge could be weaponized. Accusations of sodomy weren't just about morality, they were political tools. One of the most infamous examples is the downfall of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. Among the many charges leveled against them, heresy, idol worship, secret rituals, was sodomy. Whether true or not, the accusation painted them as enemies of God's order, making their suppression seem righteous rather than opportunistic. It was a medieval smear campaign with life or death stakes. Interestingly, the concept of sodomy wasn't static. In the early Middle Ages, it was vaguely defined, often lumped in with general sexual immorality. But from the 12th century onward, especially as universities and church doctrine grew more systematic, the definition sharpened, and the penalties grew harsher. Scholars now see sodomy less as a fixed list of acts, and more as a flexible instrument of control, a way for religious and civic authorities to police behavior, reinforce gender roles, and maintain a vision of society aligned with divine will. It reflected a culture deeply uneasy with the body, desire, and anything that defied neat categorization. So while we might think of sexuality in terms of identity or consent today, the medieval mind saw it through a lens of cosmic order, and any deviation was a crack in the foundation of that order. It's no wonder people might have approached their own bedrooms with a mix of longing and dread. And speaking of dread, nowhere was the Church's influence more intimate than in the confessional. After the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 made annual confession mandatory for all Christians, the confessional became one of the most powerful tools of social and moral control in medieval life. This wasn't just a quiet moment of repentance. It was a detailed interrogation of your innermost thoughts and actions, especially your sexual ones. Guided by penitential manuals, priests didn't just wait for confessions, they asked probing questions. Had you engaged in the English vice, a euphemism for anal sex, or the German vice, an oral sex? Had you used objects during intercourse? Tried positions that didn't face the proper way? Withdrawn before climax to avoid conception? Even impure dreams that led to nocturnal emissions could require penance. The confessor's goal was to root out any act that defied the strict procreative ideal, even within marriage. These manuals, while not transcripts of real confessions, give us an astonishingly vivid picture of what medieval people were thought to be doing, and by extension, what they likely were doing. The level of detail is almost comical in its specificity, yet deeply revealing. Were confessors genuinely concerned with souls, or did some take a prurient interest in the nitty-gritty? It's hard to say, but what's clear is that the confessional became a space where private desire met public doctrine, and desire almost always lost, and yet, despite all this surveillance and condemnation, the very existence of such exhaustive lists suggests something else, that medieval people were just as curious, experimental, and inventive in their sex lives as anyone else in history. The Church may have tried to box desire into a narrow corridor of missionary position procreation, but human nature kept finding side doors, windows, and secret passages, which brings us to one of the most disturbing and revealing fears of the medieval sexual imagination: bestiality. To modern ears, the idea is repulsive, almost unthinkable. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just a taboo, it was a profound violation of the natural and divine order. Rooted in biblical prohibitions, Leviticus, for one, is very clear on the matter, and amplified by folklore and superstition. Bestiality was seen as the ultimate blurring of boundaries between human and animal. Sacred and profane, order and chaos. Trials for bestiality did occur, rarely, but with brutal consequences. Both the human and the animal involved were often executed, sometimes in gruesome public spectacles meant to reaffirm the moral boundaries of the community. These cases weren't just about punishing sin. They were about purging contamination, restoring cosmic balance. In a world where animals could be seen as symbols of base instincts or even demonic influence, sex with a beast wasn't just deviant, it was diabolical. And yet, the fact that church manuals and legal texts spent so much time describing, categorizing, and condemning bestiality tells us something uncomfortable. It was a fear that persisted because it was imaginable. Not necessarily common, but possible enough to haunt the edges of medieval thought. So as we pull back from these shadowed corners of the past, one thing becomes clear: the medieval world wasn't a monolith of repression. It was a place of deep contradictions, where piety and passion, doctrine and desire, control and chaos existed in constant tension. People lived under the weight of rigid rules, yes, but they also found ways to love, to connect, to explore, and sometimes to transgress. And in doing so, they revealed a timeless truth, that even in the most constrained times, the human heart and body refused to be fully tamed. Bestiality was considered among the gravest sins in the medieval world, not merely a moral failing, but a catastrophic rupture in the divine order. In a society that saw the universe as a meticulously structured hierarchy, God at the top, then angels, humans, animals, and finally inanimate matter, crossing the boundary between human and beast was unthinkable. It wasn't just wrong. It was unnatural in the deepest theological sense, a rebellion against the very fabric of creation. This transgression was often linked to demonic influence. Many believed that such acts could only occur under the sway of the devil, either through direct possession or through the seduction of incubi and succubi, those shape-shifting demons said to visit humans in their sleep, sometimes taking animal form. In this light, even a disturbing dream could be interpreted as evidence of a real spiritual crime. The line between fantasy and sin was perilously thin. Both church and secular courts treated bestiality with terrifying severity. Punishments included strangulation, decapitation, or burning at the stake. And yes, the animal involved was often executed too, as if it bore moral guilt. Legal records from across Europe, though rare, document actual trials, particularly in rural communities where people and livestock lived in close quarters. These cases weren't just about justice. They were public rituals of purification, meant to restore cosmic balance and reassure the community that order had been reclaimed. Historians still debate how often these acts truly occurred. Some argue the accusations reflected real, isolated incidents. Others see them as projections of deep-seated anxieties about isolation, temptation, or the blurring of human and animal in a world where survival often meant working side by side with beasts. In some cases, the charge may have been used to destroy social outcasts or settle personal vendettas. Regardless, the persistent presence of bestiality in theological texts, confessional manuals, and law codes shows how powerfully it symbolized the ultimate violation, the loss of what made humans human. Thankfully, this dark chapter remains largely confined to history, but it serves as a stark reminder of how deeply the medieval mind was preoccupied with boundaries, with maintaining the sacred separation between the human and the animal, the pure and the profane, the divine and the demonic. From that chilling abyss, let's turn to another medieval taboo that was far more common and far more entangled in daily life: incest. You might assume that incest prohibitions have always been straightforward. Don't marry your sibling, your parent, or your child. But in the Middle Ages, the Church's rules were anything but simple. Driven by theology and a desire to regulate marriage, the definition of incest expanded to dizzying proportions. It wasn't just about blood. It included relationships formed through marriage, called affinity, spiritual bonds like godparenthood, spiritual kinship, and even prior sexual relationships. At its height, the Church forbade marriage between people related within 7 degrees of kinship. That meant if you and your intended shared a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent, yes, 6 greats back, you were considered too closely related to wed. For noble families, who often intermarried to consolidate land and power, this created a near impossible maze. Imagine trying to arrange a politically advantageous match, only to discover that your daughter's fiancé was technically her third cousin twice removed through a marriage 3 generations ago. Matchmakers must have pulled their hair out. Even more baffling was the role of godparenthood. If you served as godparent to someone's child, you became spiritually related to the parents, making marriage between you and them forbidden. Likewise, if you were godparent to your future spouse's sibling, that could invalidate the union. A simple act of faith, sponsoring a baptism, could unknowingly sabotage a future alliance. Many historians believe these expansive rules weren't just about morality. They were also a tool of ecclesiastical power. The broader the definition of incest, the more marriages the Church could declare invalid, and the more dispensations it could sell to those who needed them. A noble family desperate to marry their heir to a neighboring lord's daughter might have to petition the Pope for a special waiver, paying handsomely for the privilege. In this way, spiritual authority translated directly into political and financial leverage. So while the Church preached purity and divine order, Its incest laws also functioned as a sophisticated system of control, one that shaped dynasties, redirected inheritances, and kept even the most powerful families dependent on Rome's approval. And if navigating kinship charts felt like a nightmare, some turned to more direct methods of influencing love and desire. Enter the world of love potions. In an age of arranged marriages, where affection was often expected to grow after the vows, the longing for genuine connection, or the fear of losing it, drove people to desperate measures. Without modern psychology or chemistry, they turned to magic, folklore, and whatever strange ingredients they could gather. Love potions weren't the rose-petal brews of fairy tales. They were often grotesque, even dangerous. Recipes from medieval manuscripts call for powdered bones, animal hearts, menstrual blood, hair, and bodily fluids, sometimes even from the person whose love you sought. One might mix these with herbs like vervain or mandrake, whisper incantations over the concoction, and then slip it into a lover's wine or stew. The risks were real. Some ingredients were toxic. Others could cause severe illness. And if caught, the potion maker could be accused of witchcraft, a charge that carried its own deadly consequences. Yet the desire to control the uncontrollable, to make someone love you or stay faithful, or simply notice you, proved stronger than fear. You can almost picture the scene. A nervous servant ladling soup into a lord's bowl, hoping the powdered batwing dissolved completely, or a heartbroken woman stirring a midnight brew by candlelight, whispering a plea to saints and spirits alike. These weren't just acts of romance. They were acts of vulnerability, hope, and sometimes quiet rebellion against a world that gave people little say in their own hearts. So whether through confessionals, kinship laws, or cauldrons bubbling with questionable ingredients, medieval people constantly negotiated the tension between what they were supposed to feel and what they actually did. And in that space between doctrine and desire, we find the messy human truth of the past, not a world of rigid repression, but one of constant creative struggle to love, connect, and survive on their own terms as best they could. The methods for using love potions were as varied and as strange as the ingredients themselves. Some were meant to be drunk, slipped quietly into wine or broth. Others were rubbed onto the skin, dabbed behind the ears like a medieval perfume, or even sprinkled onto clothing, bedding, or doorways, in the hope that proximity alone would spark affection. At the heart of many of these practices was the idea of sympathetic magic, the belief that an object once connected to a person could influence them from afar. A lock of hair, a scrap of fabric from their tunic, even a footprint in the dirt might be woven into a spell. If you held something that belonged to your beloved, the logic went, you held a thread to their soul. It's a notion that feels both poetic and unnerving, especially when you consider how easily such tokens could be stolen or misused. Of course, the results were never guaranteed. At best, nothing happened, just a wasted night and a bitter-tasting stew. At worst, the toxic mixtures caused vomiting, seizures, disfigurement, or death. And if harm came to the target, the potion maker could face not just social ruin, but accusations of witchcraft, a charge that carried fines, imprisonment, or worse. The Church condemned these practices fiercely, seeing them not as romantic gestures, but as acts of spiritual rebellion, attempts to manipulate God's design through demonic means. To force love, they argued, was to deny free will, and that was a sin far deeper than unrequited longing. Yet people kept trying. Because beneath the superstition was something profoundly human, the ache to be seen, chosen, cherished. In a world where marriages were arranged for land or lineage, where women had little say in their futures, and where loneliness could be as deadly as famine, love potions offered a sliver of agency, even if it was illusory, even if it was dangerous. But as we step away from the candlelit secrecy of love spells, we must turn to a far darker truth. Sexual violence was not an anomaly in the medieval world. It was a pervasive reality, especially for those with the least power. While we've explored the curious, the quirky, and even the comical corners of medieval sexuality, it's vital to acknowledge its brutal underbelly. Sexual assault was disturbingly common, and legal protections for victims were often non-existent or deeply flawed. Women, particularly those without male relatives to speak for them or those from lower social classes, were especially vulnerable. On paper, rape was a crime, But in practice, justice was elusive. The burden of proof fell almost entirely on the victim. She might need witnesses, visible injuries, or even undergo a humiliating public examination to prove her claim. Worse still, medieval legal thinking often assumed that a woman who didn't scream loudly enough, fight back vigorously enough, or flee quickly enough had somehow consented. This wasn't just unjust, it was cruel, reinforcing a system that valued a woman's honor as property of her family, far more than her bodily autonomy. Punishments for perpetrators were inconsistent at best. A nobleman might pay a fine and walk away. A peasant might lose a hand, or his life, but only if the victim's family had the means and standing to pursue the case. In some places, the solution to rape was forced marriage. The attacker would be made to wed his victim, supposedly to restore her honor. But this only compounded the trauma, binding a woman for life to the man who violated her, often to prevent scandal or illegitimate heirs, not out of concern for her well-being. Among the nobility, abduction and forced marriage were particularly grim. What romances later painted as daring elopements were often violent seizures, women taken by force, sometimes assaulted first to ruin them for other suitors, then married off to secure land, wealth, or political alliances. These weren't tales of passion. They were acts of conquest disguised as courtship. Historians struggle to measure the true scale of this violence because so much went unrecorded. Shame, fear, and systemic bias ensured that most assaults vanished into silence. And yet, the fragments that remain paint a sobering picture. Chivalry may have been sung about in ballads, but for countless women, daily life was marked by vulnerability, not protection. Having faced this difficult truth, let's shift our gaze, not to escape it, but to see another side of how medieval people understood intimacy, community, and life itself, through the lens of fertility rituals. In a world where survival depended on the harvest, fertility wasn't just a personal concern, it was cosmic. The health of the fields, the abundance of livestock, and the ability of couples to bear children were all seen as interconnected threads in the same sacred tapestry. When the earth bloomed, so should humanity. When crops failed, it was a sign of divine displeasure or imbalance in the natural order. This worldview gave rise to vibrant, often raucous folk traditions that predated Christianity but persisted throughout the Middle Ages, sometimes cloaked in Christian symbolism. Spring festivals, harvest celebrations, and midwinter rites often pulsed with unmistakable sexual energy. Communities would gather to dance around maypoles, tall, upright poles that needed no explanation in their symbolism, or stage playful, exaggerated performances mimicking mating and birth. In some villages, couples might leap over bonfires together to ensure conception. In others, young men and women engaged in ritualized courtship games that blurred the line between play and promise. Mock weddings between figures representing the Earth Mother and Sky Father were common, echoing ancient pagan rites now dressed in saints' names or church feast days. The church often frowned upon these customs, but rarely succeeded in erasing them. They were too deeply rooted in the rhythms of planting and harvest, too tied to the raw, undeniable pulse of life. These weren't just parties. They were acts of collective hope, a way for entire communities to participate in the renewal of the world. In a time of plague, famine, and infant mortality, celebrating fertility was an act of defiance against despair. It acknowledged that while sex could be controlled, punished, or exploited, it was also, fundamentally, a source of life. And life, in all its messy, earthy glory, demanded to be honored. So as we close this chapter of our journey, we're left with a complex portrait, a society wrestling with desire, power, faith, and fear, all while trying to survive, connect, and bring new life into a world that was often harsh, but never without beauty. The line between symbolic fertility and actual licentious behavior during these festivals was often astonishingly thin, sometimes non-existent. It's as if the whole village, weary from winter and desperate for abundance, collectively turned to the earth and said, "Please, Mother Nature, give us a good harvest," and then followed it up with a dance so suggestive it left little to the imagination. In these moments, the usual pious restraint of daily life melted away. People laughed louder, danced harder, and flirted more freely. The atmosphere crackled with an almost primal energy, a raw celebration of life in all its forms. And at the heart of many of these revelries were fertility effigies, Dolls or figures made of straw, cloth, or wood carried through the streets in procession, blessed by local priests, sometimes reluctantly, or even married in mock ceremonies to symbolize the union of earth and sky. These weren't abstract icons. They were tangible vessels of hope, believed to channel the very force that made seeds sprout and wombs quicken. What makes these rituals especially compelling is their communal nature. Everyone participated, not just as spectators, but as co-creators of prosperity. A good harvest meant survival for all, so ensuring fertility became a shared spiritual and practical act. Scholars still debate whether participants consciously saw these rites as magical interventions or simply enjoyed them as boisterous seasonal parties that happened to echo older beliefs. But the persistence of such customs across centuries suggests something deeper. A fundamental human need to connect with the cycles of life, death, and renewal, even if it meant dancing around a maypole in a way that raised more than a few clerical eyebrows. It was a world where the sacred and the sensual weren't opposites, but partners, waltzing together in service of survival. From this earthy celebration of life, let's shift to something seemingly more mundane, but surprisingly revealing: sumptuary laws. Note, the original text mistakenly says sanctuary laws, but context clearly refers to sumptuary laws, regulations governing clothing and consumption. Medieval society was obsessed with order, and nothing signaled your place in the hierarchy more clearly than what you wore. Sumptuary laws enforced across much of Europe dictated everything. Which fabrics you could wear, silk and fur, were strictly for nobles. What colors were permitted, purple and deep red were often royal monopolies. How much embroidery you could display, and even how long your shoes' pointed toes could be. The goal? To keep social boundaries visible and unbreachable. But humans being humans, people found ways to bend the rules. A merchant's wife might not be allowed velvet, but she could cut her neckline just a finger's width lower than modesty demanded, or drape her cloak in a way that hinted at allure without technically breaking any law. A young woman might wear her veil slightly askew, not enough to draw official censure, but enough to catch the eye of a certain suitor. Belts, brooches, the fold of a sleeve, these became subtle signals in a society where direct flirtation could ruin reputations. Clothing, in other words, became a secret language. Beneath the rigid surface of regulated dress, desire whispered in stitches and silhouettes. And ironically, by trying so hard to control appearance, authorities may have unintentionally fostered a far more nuanced and intriguing culture of coded communication. After all, what's more thrilling than sending a message only your lover can read? But if private signals thrived in the shadows, punishment for sexual transgressions was anything but subtle. When illicit acts were discovered, justice was often theatrical, brutal, and deeply public. Fornication, adultery, or a priest keeping a concubine didn't just result in quiet penance. They could land you in the pillory or stocks, trapped in wooden frames while the entire town hurled insults, rotten fruit, or worse. A sign around your neck would spell out your sin for all to see: adulteress, whoremonger, false priest. This wasn't rehabilitation, it was ritual humiliation, designed to scar your reputation far more than your skin. Women caught in adultery might have their hair shaved, a devastating mark of shame in a culture where long, covered hair symbolized virtue. Others were forced to parade through town in ridiculous costumes, or endure public whippings that left them physically bruised and socially exiled. The message was clear: your private choices belong to the community, and straying from the path would cost you your dignity. These spectacles served as living sermons, warnings etched not in stone, but in human suffering. And yet their very existence betrays a deeper truth. Medieval society knew how powerful desire was. The harshness of the punishment reveals just how often people did stray. Fear, it seems, was the only tool strong enough, or so they hoped, to hold back the tide of human longing. But the most terrifying intersection of sex, power, and fear came not from town squares or confessionals, but from the shadowy realm of witchcraft accusations. In a world haunted by plague, famine, and infant death, people sought explanations and scapegoats. Witchcraft provided both, and from the late Middle Ages onward, accusations of witchcraft became increasingly tied to sexual deviance, especially when the accused was a woman. The prevailing belief held that witches didn't just curse crops or sour milk. They consorted with the devil himself, often in explicitly sexual ways. Demonologists wrote obsessively about nocturnal orgies at Sabbaths, where witches kissed the devil's backside, engaged in group sex with demons, incubi, and renounced their baptism through obscene acts. Women who lived alone, spoke their minds, healed with herbs, or simply defied expectations were especially vulnerable. Their independence was recast as diabolical lust. This link between female sexuality and demonic corruption turned suspicion into a death sentence. A widow who refused remarriage, a midwife who knew too much about contraception, or a woman who rejected a man's advances might soon find herself accused not just of immorality, but of treason against God. And once labeled a witch, her body became a site of interrogation. Proof of witchcraft often included searching for the devil's mark, an insensitive spot on the skin, sometimes interpreted as a supernumerary nipple, allegedly used to feed familiars. Under torture, many confessed to impossible sexual acts with demons, not because they happened, but because pain and terror made fantasy indistinguishable from truth. The witch trials, though peaking after the medieval period, had deep roots in these medieval fears. They reveal a society that viewed uncontrolled female desire not just as sinful, but as apocalyptic, a crack in the divine order through which chaos could pour. So as we reach the end of this journey through medieval sexuality, from love potions to public shaming, from fertility dances to witch hunts, we're left with a world far more complex than myths of chaste knights and obedient maidens suggest. It was a world of contradictions, rigid yet inventive, pious yet passionate, repressive yet teeming with life, and perhaps that's the real lesson. For all its rules, threats, and dogma, the medieval world never fully succeeded in taming human desire. Instead, it gave us a mirror, showing how, in every age, people struggle, yearn, hide, confess, rebel, and love, often in the most unexpected ways. The late medieval period, particularly from the 14th century onward, saw a dramatic and terrifying escalation in the persecution of alleged witches across Europe. What began as suspicion of folk healers or village-wise women morphed into a full-blown moral panic, a hunt for individuals believed to be in league with the devil, capable of blighting crops, killing infants, and summoning storms through malevolent magic. And at the heart of this fear, sex, not just any sex, but demonic sex. Theologians and demonologists insisted that the devil's most potent weapon was sexual temptation. Women in particular were portrayed as inherently vulnerable to his seductions due to their weaker nature and excessive carnal desires. Accusations often included lurid claims of intercourse with incubi, male demons, or succubi, female demons, or participation in the so-called witches' Sabbath, a fantastical nocturnal gathering where initiates supposedly renounced God, kissed the devil's backside, and engaged in orgiastic rites that inverted every tenet of Christian morality. Direct evidence is scarce. Objects made of wood, leather, or cloth rarely survive centuries, and anything suggestive would have been destroyed or hidden. Yet tantalizing clues remain. Some medieval medical texts describe instruments used to treat hysteria in women, often involving pelvic massage, which modern scholars interpret as a euphemistic cover for sexual release. Others point to smooth, carved objects found in domestic contexts whose purpose remains ambiguous. Tools, or something more personal. More likely, everyday items were repurposed. Polished stones, rolled fabric, shaped pieces of wood. Human ingenuity, after all, thrives in secrecy. The absence of explicit proof doesn't mean absence of practice. It simply means people were careful. And why wouldn't they be? In a world where even a dream could be deemed demonic, private pleasure had to stay private. This quiet persistence reminds us that even in the most controlled societies, the body retains its autonomy, its hunger, its curiosity, its need for comfort. Desire doesn't disappear, it just learns to whisper. Which brings us to those whispers in the night. Dreams, demons, and the terrifying blur between fantasy and sin. In the medieval mind, dreams weren't just random firings of the brain. They were messages, warnings, or invasions. and few were more feared than the visitation of incubi and succubi, demons who came in the night to seduce the sleeping. Incubi, male demons, were said to lie upon women, engaging in intercourse so real it could leave them exhausted, pregnant, or ill. Succubi did the same to men, sometimes collecting their seed to impregnate other women, a convoluted demonic logistic system to be sure. These weren't folk tales. They were theological realities, discussed in sermons, legal manuals, and medical texts alike. Imagine waking from a vivid, erotic dream, only to wonder, was that me or the devil? For many, nocturnal emissions weren't natural. They were spiritual assaults. Confessors would probe, did you invite this with impure thoughts? Or were you an innocent victim? Either way, guilt could follow you into the confessional booth. Some physicians offered natural explanations, diet, humoral imbalance, but even they often conceded that demons might be involved. After all, how else to explain sleep paralysis, wet dreams, or the shame that clung to them? The belief in incubi and succubi gave a name to the nameless, a cause to the inexplicable. But it also turned the bedroom into a battleground, where even sleep offered no sanctuary. Yet for all this fear, medieval Christianity also held a surprising capacity for compassion, especially when it came to those society cast aside. Take prostitutes. Officially they were sinners, outcasts, living symbols of moral decay. They were barred from churches, forced to wear distinctive clothing, and vulnerable to violence. And yet, they were also seen as souls worth saving. This paradox found its embodiment in certain patron saints, most notably Mary Magdalene. Though modern scholarship questions whether she was ever a prostitute, medieval tradition firmly cast her as a repentant sinner, redeemed by Christ's grace. Her story was told in sermons, painted on chapel walls, and held up as proof that no one was beyond forgiveness. For a woman trapped in the sex trade, Mary Magdalene wasn't just a saint, she was hope made flesh. Other figures like Saint Afra, a Roman martyr said to have converted from prostitution, offered similar paths to redemption. Religious confraternities even formed to help fallen women leave brothels, offering shelter, work, and spiritual guidance. It's a striking duality. Society condemned the sin, but the church offered a ladder out. We disapprove of your profession, the message seemed to say, but we believe in your soul. In a world of rigid morality, this was radical grace. Finally, let's step into the sunlit chaos of the tournament field, where chivalry, rivalry, and romance collided in a spectacle of clashing lances and fluttering favors. Jousts weren't just martial contests. They were theater. Knights didn't ride for glory alone. They rode for love. A lady's scarf tied to a lance, a sleeve pinned to armor. These weren't mere decorations. They were declarations. Every tilt of the lance was a sonnet in motion, every victory a public vow of devotion. Noble women sat in the stands not as passive spectators, but as judges of worth. A knight's performance reflected on his lady's honor, and her favor could elevate his status or ignite bitter rivalries. Tales abound of knights fighting to avenge a slight to their beloved, or of ladies playing suitors against each other in games of courtly intrigue. It was courtship as combat, love as performance, and beneath the pageantry pulsed real desire, jealousy, and ambition. The jousting field, for all its pageantry, was as much a stage for sexual politics as any royal court. So, as we reach the end of this journey, through brothels and relics, love potions and witch trials, hidden desires and public shaming, one truth echoes louder than all the rest. Medieval sexuality was never simple. It was a tangle of faith and flesh, repression and invention, fear and longing. The church may have drawn strict lines, but people lived in the spaces between, sometimes in secret, sometimes in defiance, always in search of connection. And in that messy, human struggle, we see not just the past, but a mirror of our own enduring quest to love, desire, and be seen on our own terms. From the desperate and dangerous acts of seeking abortion, let's now shift our gaze, not to escape the gravity of those choices, but to witness another side of medieval life where desire, indulgence, and social order collided in a very different kind of chaos, the world of feasts and forbidden fancies. In the Middle Ages, feasting wasn't just about eating. It was theater, politics, and pleasure, all rolled into one lavish, often raucous spectacle. Held in great halls lit by firelight and dripping with tapestries, these gatherings were where nobles displayed their wealth, sealed alliances, and quite often let their inhibitions slip along with their wine. A profound historical fact is that medieval feasts followed a strict rhythm of abundance and restraint, mirroring the Church's liturgical calendar. During Lent or Advent, tables were sparse. No meat, no dairy, just fish and vegetables. But when those fasts ended, the floodgates opened. Easter, Christmas, weddings, saints' days. Any occasion became an excuse for excess. Roasted peacocks served with their feathers reattached. Whole boars with apples in their mouths. Swans gilded in gold leaf. These weren't just meals. They were performances of power, designed to awe guests and assert dominance. But beneath the pageantry, something more intimate often simmered. Feasts were rare moments when social barriers softened. Men and women who normally kept careful distance could sit side by side, share wine from the same cup, exchange glances over spiced wine and honeyed figs. The dim light, the music, the flowing drink, all created an atmosphere where flirtation could bloom, even in the most rigid courts. And then there were the games. Some feasts included games of love, ritualized exchanges where guests drew lots to pair off as lords and ladies for the evening, engaging in playful courtship under the guise of entertainment. Others featured bawdy songs, suggestive dances, or even masked revels where identities blurred and propriety loosened. In these moments, the rules of courtly love met the reality of human attraction, and not always chastely. Of course, this freedom had limits. A noblewoman caught in a compromising situation could face ruin. A servant who overstepped might be dismissed or worse. But the very existence of these spaces, where laughter was louder, touches lingered longer, and eyes held a little too long, reveals a truth. Even in a world of strict morality, people carved out corners for joy, connection, and yes, forbidden desire. Feasts, then, were more than just banquets. They were pressure valves, brief sanctioned escapes from the weight of daily life, where the body's hungers, for food, for touch, for delight, could be indulged, however cautiously, within the bounds of spectacle. And so, as we near the end of this journey through the tangled, tender, and sometimes terrifying landscape of medieval sexuality, we're left with a world far richer and more human than the myths suggest. It was a world where love could be a whispered poem or a public joust, where desire might be channeled into a fertility dance or hidden in a vial of herbs, where sin and salvation walked hand in hand. People lived under the shadow of dogma, yes, but they also found ways to laugh, to touch, to hope, and to love, often in defiance of the very systems meant to control them. The Middle Ages weren't a monolith of repression. They were a mosaic of contradictions, pious yet passionate, rigid yet inventive, fearful yet fiercely alive. And in that complexity, we don't just see the past, we see ourselves. Because the longing to connect, to choose, to feel, to survive, that never goes out of fashion. Medieval life, for all its rigid structures and daily hardships, was punctuated by moments of exuberant release, grand feasts celebrating royal coronations, weddings, military victories, or the simple miracle of a bountiful harvest. These weren't just meals, they were communal explosions of joy, where the usual rules softened, if only for a night. Imagine a noble hall ablaze with torchlight, tables groaning under roasted boar, swans in golden plumage, and spiced wine flowing endlessly. Minstrels played lively tunes, jesters cracked bawdy jokes, and guests laughed with abandon. For common folk, village fairs and seasonal festivals offered their own version of this liberation, less opulent perhaps, but no less spirited. In these moments, the weight of daily toil lifted and people allowed themselves to. And in that atmosphere of music, drink, and shared celebration, boundaries often blurred. Alcohol loosened tongues and inhibitions. Crowds offered anonymity. A moonlit garden, a shadowed alcove, or a quiet path during a nighttime procession could become the setting for a stolen kiss, or something far more intimate. Feasts created rare opportunities for encounters that would be impossible under the watchful eyes of a tightly knit village. Travelers, strangers, and distant relatives mingled freely, and with them came the thrill of fleeting connections. Of course, moralists of the time warned against such excesses. Sermons railed against drunkenness and lewd behavior at feasts, and penitential manuals listed post-feast confessions as all too common. But the very frequency of these warnings suggests they were responding to a real phenomenon, that when joy ran high and wine flowed freely, so too did desire. Was every feast a den of debauchery? Almost certainly not. But the possibility was there, and that's what mattered. These gatherings offered a sanctioned pause from restraint, a temporary suspension of the strict moral order that governed everyday life. And in that space, human nature, as it always does, found room to breathe. Which brings us to one of the most revealing windows into medieval attitudes about sex: their literature. While church doctrine painted a picture of stern morality, popular medieval stories often burst with bawdy humor, sexual innuendo, and gleeful mockery of hypocrisy. Take the fabliaux, short, comic tales written in vernacular French from the 12th century onward. These weren't pious parables. They were the medieval equivalent of raunchy sitcoms, filled with cheating spouses, lustful priests, clever wives, and gullible husbands. In one classic fabliau, a wife convinces her husband she's become invisible so she can sneak off with her lover. In another, a priest's clumsy attempts to seduce a parishioner end in humiliation. The humor wasn't erotic. It was satirical, absurd, and deeply human. Audiences didn't just tolerate these stories. They loved them. They were told in taverns, at fairs, and in noble courts alike, provoking laughter and knowing glances. This literary tradition reveals a striking disconnect between official morality and popular culture. While the church thundered from the pulpit, ordinary people joked, flirted, and recognized their own messy realities in these tales. The existence of such earthy, irreverent literature suggests that medieval people weren't uniformly prudish or repressed. They had a robust sense of humor about sex, hypocrisy, and the follies of desire. Scholars debate whether these stories were mere entertainment or subtle social critique. But either way, they remind us that beneath the surface of piety, medieval life pulsed with vitality, irony, and a very human appreciation for the absurdities of love and lust. And so, as we come to the end of this journey through the labyrinth of medieval sexuality, from love potions brewed in secrecy to public shaming in the stocks, from whispered confessions to raucous feasts and lewd laughter, we're left with a powerful truth. The Middle Ages were never as simple as we imagine. Yes, the Church wielded immense power, shaping laws, confessions, and consciences with an iron grip on what was natural and sinful. But human desire, as always, refused to be contained. It flowed around the edges of doctrine, in the regulated brothels of city councils, in the quiet bonds between nuns, in the coded poetry of monks, in the herbal remedies passed from mother to daughter, in the laughter at a bawdy tale told over wine. What seems bizarre to us, wearing a weasel's testicle for fertility, confessing dreams of demons, dancing around a maypole to ensure a good harvest, was, to them, part of the fabric of life. And what seems normal to us, consent, autonomy, diverse expressions of identity, would have been alien, even dangerous, in their world. Yet beneath the differences in belief and practice, the core experiences remain hauntingly familiar: the ache of longing, the sting of jealousy, the joy of connection, the fear of judgment, the desperate hope for control over one's own body and destiny. The legacy of medieval sexuality isn't just a catalog of strange customs. It's a mirror. It shows us how every era grapples with the same tensions between faith and flesh, order and desire, public shame and private truth. And in that reflection, we see not just the past, but ourselves. So as you close this chapter, perhaps with a grateful sigh for modern medicine, plumbing, and the right to love who you choose, remember that the human heart, in all its messy, yearning complexity, has always beaten the same rhythm. Sweet dreams, certainly. Here is a continuation of your narrative in the same calm, natural storytelling tone, expanding the world with rich historical texture, layered characters, and unresolved mystery. The story remains open-ended, inviting further exploration, and stays within the thematic universe you've built, a medieval world where desire, faith, secrecy, and survival intertwine. In the year of our Lord 1342, In the shadowed valley of the River Vire, nestled between Normandy's rolling hills and dense oak forests, there stood a village so small it barely warranted a name on any map. The locals called it Sainte-Clotilde-sur-Brume, Sainte Clotilde on the Mist, not for any grand cathedral or holy relic, but because the morning fog clung to the riverbanks like a shroud, and someone long ago had carved a crude wooden saint into the trunk of a lightning-struck yew tree near the mill. It was here, in this quiet corner of Christendom, that Elodie found herself standing at the edge of everything she thought she knew. She wasn't noble, nor was she a nun, just a healer's daughter, raised on poultices of yarrow and whispered warnings about the devil's herbs. Her mother had died 2 winters past, coughing blood into a linen square Elodie still kept tucked in her chest, stained rust brown and smelling faintly of sage. Since then, Elodie had taken over the cottage by the willow copse, tending to birthing mothers, fevered children, and the occasional shepherd with a snake bite. She knew the language of roots and moon phases better than she knew Latin prayers, though she recited the latter dutifully every evening, just in case God was listening. But lately, God, or something else, had begun to feel very close. It started with the dreams, not the usual kind, fleeting images of falling or forgotten chores, but vivid, clinging visions that left her drenched in sweat and trembling long after dawn. In them, she walked through a forest she didn't recognize, barefoot on moss so soft it felt like skin. A man waited for her there, cloaked in shadows, his face never clear, but his voice low and warm as embers. He never touched her. He only spoke, "You are not alone. The old ways remember you." At first, she dismissed it as humoral imbalance, too much melancholy bile from grief and solitude. She drank chamomile, avoided red meat, and slept with a sprig of rosemary under her pillow. But the dreams returned deeper each time until one night she woke with the taste of honey and ash on her tongue, and a single white feather resting on her chest. There were no white birds in Sainte Clotilde. She buried the feather beneath the yew tree, whispering an Ave Maria over it like an exorcism. But the next morning, old Marguerite from the mill came limping to her door, clutching her swollen belly. "Elodie," she gasped, eyes wide with fear. "The midwife from Caen won't come. Says there's plague in Avranches." "You're all we've got?" Elodie nodded, her hand steady despite the dread coiling in her gut. Marguerite was 40 with 6 living children and 3 buried stillborn. This pregnancy had been hard from the start, bleeding, cramps, dreams of drowning. Now, at full term, her water had broken at midnight, and the labor had stalled by dawn. Inside the dim, smoke-thick cottage, Elodie knelt between Marguerite's legs, her fingers probing gently. The babe was breech, turned wrong in the womb. She murmured calming words, but her mind raced. She knew the herbs that could ease the passage, blue cohosh, black cohosh, but they were dangerous. Too much, and the mother bled out. Too little, and the child died in the birth canal. As she prepared a tincture, Marguerite gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let it be another ghost," she whispered, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "Please, give me a living child." Elodie's throat tightened. She thought of her own mother's last words. Some lives are meant to stay in the earth. But she couldn't say that now. She added an extra drop of tincture. An hour later, a boy cried, thin, furious, alive. Marguerite wept with joy, pressing the infant to her breast. The village women who'd gathered outside cheered softly, crossing themselves. Elodie washed her hands in cold water, her knees weak with relief. But as she stepped into the twilight, she saw him. A stranger stood at the edge of the barley field watching the cottage. Tall, cloaked in dark wool, his face half hidden by a hood. He didn't move as she approached. Didn't flee when she called out. Only raised a hand in silent greeting. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady, though her pulse hammered. "A traveler," he said. His accent was unfamiliar, southern, perhaps Occitan. "I heard there was a woman here who could bring life where death lingered." She stiffened. "I'm no miracle worker, just a healer," he smiled faintly. "All healers are miracle workers to those who suffer." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "For your kindness," he said, placing it in her palm before she could refuse. "A gift from one who walks the old paths." Then he turned and vanished into the mist. Inside the bundle was a vial of amber liquid, and a dried sprig of mandrake root, its forked shape unmistakable. Elodie's breath caught. Mandrake was forbidden, not just dangerous but diabolical. Legends said it screamed when pulled from the earth, killing those who heard it. The church called it the devil's apple, yet her mother had kept a piece hidden beneath the hearthstone. That night, Elodie didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, the vial glinting in the low light. She uncorked it. The scent was sweet, musky, like crushed petals and damp earth. She dipped a finger, tasted it, and felt a warmth spread through her chest, not unlike the feeling in her dreams. The next morning, the village priest, Father Renard, came calling. He was a thin man with sharp eyes and sharper sermons, newly arrived from Rouen and eager to purify the parish. He'd already banned the May Day dance and confiscated the villagers' idolatrous fertility dolls. "Elodie," he said, standing stiffly in her doorway, "I hear you delivered Marguerite's child with unusual methods." She kept her face neutral. "God granted the strength. I only assisted." He stepped inside without invitation, his gaze sweeping over her shelves of herbs, her mortar and pestle, the bone-handled knife she used for cutting roots. "I've heard whispers, that you use charms, that you speak to the wind." "I speak to no one but God and my patients, Father." He paused, then fixed her with a look that chilled her more than winter. "Be careful, child. The line between healing and heresy is thinner than spider silk, and the devil often wears the face of mercy." He left without another word, but his warning clung to her like damp wool. Days passed. The stranger didn't return, yet strange things began to happen. A ewe that had been barren for 3 seasons gave birth to twins. The well behind Elodie's cottage, long brackish, suddenly ran clear and sweet. And in her dreams the forest grew closer, so close she could smell the pine resin, feel the cool bark beneath her palms. Then came the letter. It arrived tucked inside a loaf of bread from the baker's wife, a scrap of parchment folded tight, sealed with wax bearing no mark. Inside, a single line in elegant script. "The white hart gathers at the solstice. If you seek answers, come alone. Follow the river north until the stones sing." Elodie stared at the words until they blurred. The White Hart? She'd heard the name in old songs, a secret fellowship of those who still honored the old gods, the earth spirits, the forgotten saints. Some called them witches, others wise ones. She should burn it, report it to Father Renard. But something in her, something deeper than fear, whispered, "Go." That night, she packed a satchel, dried apples, a flask of water, her mother's knife, the mandrake root, and the amber vial. She left a note pinned to her door. "Gone to gather herbs in the high woods. Return in 3 days." No one would believe her, but no one would follow either. She walked north as the moon rose, the river glinting like liquid silver beside her. The forest swallowed the path by midnight. Owls called. Branches snapped in the dark. But she didn't turn back. On the 3rd day, she found them, not a gathering of witches, as she'd feared, but a circle of standing stones, ancient and moss-covered, nestled in a glade where the river forked. And in the center, a fire burned, though no one tended it. Around it sat 7 figures, cloaked and silent. One stood as she approached. It was the stranger. "You came," he said, not surprised. "Who are you?" she asked again. "My name is Thibault, and I've been waiting for you since your mother died." Her breath hitched. "You knew her?" "She was one of us, a keeper of the greenways. When she passed, we watched you, gave you time to grieve, to grow. But the gift in you, it's waking, and you can't ignore it much longer." He gestured to the fire. "Sit, the solstice is near. The veil is thin. Tonight the stones will speak." Elodie hesitated. This was madness, blasphemy. Yet, hadn't her mother's hands always known which herb to use before the fever peaked? Hadn't she whispered to the bees before harvesting honey? She stepped into the circle. As the fire crackled, Thibault poured a drop of the amber liquid into a cup of water and handed it to her. "Drink, it will help you hear." She did. At first, nothing. Then a hum, low, resonant, rising from the earth itself. The stones began to glow faintly, veins of quartz catching the firelight like veins of blood. And in her mind, voices, not words, but feelings. "Welcome. Remember, you belong." Tears streamed down her face. For the first time since her mother's death, she didn't feel alone. But as the night deepened, Thibault grew grave. "There is danger," he said quietly. "The church has sent inquisitors to the region. They hunt those who practice the old arts. Father Renard is not just a priest, he reports to them." Elodie's blood ran cold. "He's watching me, he suspects. But he has no proof, yet." "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Not want," he said gently. "Need. The old ways are fading. The forests are being cleared for monasteries. The river's dammed for mills. If we don't pass the knowledge on, it will vanish, and with it, the balance between earth and spirit." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have a choice, Elodie. Walk away now, return to your cottage and live a quiet life. Or stay, learn, and carry the thread forward. But know this, if you choose us, there is no turning back. The church does not forgive what it cannot understand." Before she could answer, a horn sounded in the distance. Sharp, metallic, wrong. Thibault's face darkened. "They're closer than I thought." He blew out the fire with a breath. "Go, now take the eastern path. Don't look back, but go!" She ran. Branches tore at her cloak. Her heart pounded like a war drum. Behind her, shouts echoed through the trees. Torchlight flickered between the trunks. She didn't stop until she reached the riverbank, gasping, her side burning. She crouched in the reeds, listening. The voices faded, but she knew they'd be searching. When dawn broke, she was miles from home, mud-caked and trembling. She found a hollow beneath a fallen oak and slept fitfully. The amber vial clutched in her fist. She didn't return to Sainte Clotilde that day, or the next. Instead, she wandered deeper into the wilds, guided by instincts she didn't know she had, toward springs that sang, trees that whispered, and dreams that now felt more real than waking. Back in the village, Father Renard posted a notice on the church door. "Elodie of the Willow Copse is missing. Any who see her are to report to the parish at once. Suspicion of heretical practices." But the villagers said nothing. Marguerite's baby thrived. The ewes bore strong lambs. The well stayed sweet, and in the forest, far from prying eyes, Elodie began to learn the names of things the church had long forgotten. She didn't know it yet. But her journey had only just begun. For in a monastery not 50 leagues away, a young scribe named Brother Lucien was transcribing an ancient text recovered from a ruined pagan temple, and in its margins, he found a sketch of a woman with a white feather in her hair, standing before a circle of stones, and beneath it, a single phrase in a dead tongue. "She who hears the earth will wake the sleeping god." Lucien didn't understand the words. But that night he dreamed of a healer with eyes like river stones, and a voice that called his name. Somewhere, the threads were pulling tighter, and the solstice was coming. Certainly. Here is a continuation of the story in the same calm, immersive tone, expanding the mystery, deepening the characters, and weaving together the spiritual, political, and personal tensions of the medieval world. At 3,000 words, it builds on Elodie's flight into the wilds and introduces new layers of danger, revelation, and connection without resolving the central mystery. The story remains open, pulsing with possibility. The forest did not forgive, but it did not punish either. It simply was, vast, ancient, and indifferent to the fears of one woman with mud on her boots and a stolen vial in her pocket. Elodie walked for 3 days without seeing another soul. She drank from mossy springs, ate bitter berries she recognized from her mother's lessons, and slept curled beneath the roots of fallen oaks. Each night the dreams returned, not as visions now, but as conversations. The voice in the forest no longer spoke in riddles. It asked questions. "Do you remember the first time you healed someone? Why do you fear your own power? What would you give to bring her back?" She never answered aloud, but in her heart the replies came unbidden, a child with a fever. Because it feels like betrayal. Everything. On the 4th morning, she found the shrine. It wasn't grand, just a moss-covered stone carved with the faint outline of a woman holding a crescent moon. At its base, offerings had been left, a comb of honeycomb, a lock of dark hair tied with red thread, a small clay bowl filled with rainwater. Someone still tended this place. Someone still remembered Elodie knelt. She placed her mother's linen square beside the bowl. "I don't know if you're listening," she whispered, "but I need to understand." As if in answer, a raven landed on a nearby branch. It cocked its head, then dropped something at her feet, a smooth river stone, black as night, veined with white. She picked it up. It was warm. That afternoon the rain came, not the gentle mist of Sainte Clotilde, but a hard, driving downpour that turned the forest floor to sludge. She took shelter in a shallow cave, shivering as her cloak soaked through. She lit no fire. Smoke would betray her. Instead, she wrapped herself in damp wool and tried to sleep, but sleep brought no rest. This time, the dream was different. She stood not in a forest, but in a stone chamber lit by candlelight. A man sat at a desk, quill in hand, transcribing a book bound in cracked leather. His face was young, earnest, shadowed by exhaustion. As she watched, he paused, frowned at a passage, then wrote in the margin, "She who hears the earth will wake the sleeping god." He looked up, as if he felt her gaze, and their eyes met across the dream. Elodie gasped awake, heart pounding. Rain drummed on the cave mouth. The raven stone lay in her palm, humming faintly. Who was he? She didn't know. But she knew one thing. The church was not just hunting her. It was searching for something. And she was part of the map. Meanwhile, in the Benedictine monastery of Saint-Martin de Boucherville, Brother Lucien dipped his quill once more into the inkwell. His fingers stained black to the knuckles. The text before him was unlike any he'd copied in his 10 years as a scribe. Written in a mix of Latin and an older guttural tongue, it spoke of the sleeper, beneath the roots of the veil between worlds, and of a woman marked by feather and fire, who would open the gate when the stars align. He'd found the manuscript hidden behind a loose stone in the scriptorium wall, left perhaps by a monk long dead, or by someone who never meant it to be found. The abbot had ordered all pagan texts burned after the last heresy trial. This one had clearly escaped the pyre. Lucien shouldn't be reading it. He knew that. But something in the words called to him, not as temptation but as truth. He'd always felt out of place among the brothers, too quiet, too curious, too haunted by dreams of green places he'd never seen. That night, after Compline, he returned to the scriptorium under cover of darkness. He lit a single candle and turned to the final page. There, drawn in faded ochre, was a symbol, a circle with a feather inside, surrounded by 7 stars. As he traced it with his finger, the candle flame flickered, not from draught, but as if breathing. And in that moment, he saw her, a woman with wild hair and eyes like storm clouds, standing in a cave, rain on her face, holding a black stone. She looked afraid, but also determined. He jerked his hand back as if burned. "Impossible," he muttered, but the image lingered. The next morning, he went to the abbot. "Father," he said carefully, "I've been transcribing the old land records. There's mention of a standing stone circle near the Vire River. Do you know of it?" The abbot's eyes narrowed. "That place is cursed. Pagan relics. The bishop ordered it destroyed years ago." "Why do you ask?" "No reason," Lucien said quickly. "Just scholarly interest." But that night he packed a satchel, bread, a water skin, his copy of the manuscript, and the small iron cross his mother had given him at his tonsure. He left no note. He simply walked out the postern gate as the moon rose, heading west. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he had to find her. Elodie, unaware of the monk now walking toward her, pressed deeper into the wilds. The raven became her constant companion, appearing at dawn and dusk, sometimes leading her to hidden springs or patches of rare herbs. She began to understand its calls, not as words, but as warnings, directions, comfort. On the 7th day, she reached the high ridge where the river split into 2, and there, just as the letter had said, the stones sang, not with sound, but with vibration, a low thrumming in the earth that traveled up her legs as she approached. The circle was larger than she'd imagined. 13 stones, each taller than a man, arranged in a perfect ring. At the center stood an altar of uncut granite, stained dark with age. This was no druidic ruin. This was a living place. She stepped inside. Immediately the air changed, warmer, thicker, humming with energy. The raven landed on the altar and let out a single, sharp cry. Then the ground trembled. Not an earthquake. Something deeper, as if the earth itself were stirring in its sleep. From the stones, shadows began to rise, not solid but shimmering, like heat haze given form. Figures emerged, women with braided hair and antlers on their brows, men with crow feathers in their cloaks, children holding glowing acorns. They didn't speak. They simply watched her. Elodie fell to her knees, not in fear, but in recognition. "You've been waiting," she whispered. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman with silver hair and eyes like polished obsidian. She placed a hand on Elodie's head. Warmth flooded her, and with it, memories not her own. Her mother kneeling here, years ago, swearing an oath. Her grandmother planting seeds under a blood moon. Generations of women tending the veil, keeping the balance. "You are the seventh," the woman said, her voice echoing as if from a great distance. "The last before the gate opens." "What gate?" Elodie asked. "The one beneath the roots of the world tree. The sleeper stirs. The stars are aligning. And the church. They sense it too." As if on cue, a distant horn echoed through the valley. The figures flickered, fading like mist. "Go," the silver-haired woman urged. "They are coming. Find the monk. He carries the key." Then she was gone. Elodie scrambled to her feet, heart racing. The monk? The man from her dream? She barely had time to process it before hoofbeats thundered in the distance. Torchlight flickered through the trees. She ran, not toward the village, but deeper into the mountains, toward the old hermit's cave her mother had once mentioned. It was said to be hidden behind a waterfall, known only to those who listened to the water's song. She reached the cliff just as the first riders crested the ridge. Drenched and breathless, she plunged into the icy cascade, feeling her way along the rock face until her fingers found a crevice. She squeezed through, collapsing into darkness. Inside, the cave was dry, warm, and smelled of dried herbs and beeswax. A single oil lamp burned on a stone shelf, and sitting cross-legged beside it was Thibaut. "You're late," he said, not looking up from the map he was drawing in the dirt. Elodie stared. "How did you—" "The stones warned me. And the raven." He finally looked at her. "You saw them." "The keepers," she nodded, still trembling. "They said I'm the seventh, and that a monk has the key." Thibault's expression darkened. "Then we have less time than I thought. The Inquisition has sent a special envoy, a Dominican named Father Gervais. He doesn't just hunt heretics. He hunts awakenings. And he believes the sleeper's return will bring the Antichrist." "He's wrong," Elodie said fiercely. "Does it matter?" Thibault stood, brushing dirt from his robes. "To him, any power outside the church is demonic. And you, Elodie, are very powerful." He walked to the back of the cave and pulled aside a tapestry woven with stars and roots. Behind it was a narrow tunnel. "This leads to the old pilgrimage route, the one the church sealed centuries ago. It will take you to Mont Saint-Michel. There's a sisterhood there who still guard the old ways in secret." "I can't leave," she said. "Not if the sleeper is waking. Not if I'm part of this." "You're not meant to stop it," Thibault said gently. "You're meant to guide it. But you can't do that if you're burning at the stake." Before she could argue, a crash echoed from outside, the waterfall disturbed. "They've found the entrance," Thibault hissed. "Go, now." He pressed a small leather pouch into her hand. "Mandrake root, belladonna, and a lock of your mother's hair. It will protect you on the road." Elodie hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll lead them astray." He gave her a sad smile. "Some threads must be cut so others may weave." She wanted to protest, to stay and fight. But the hoofbeats were closer now, voices shouting in Latin. She turned and fled into the tunnel. It was narrow, damp, and pitch black. She crawled for what felt like hours, guided only by the faint glow of the raven stone in her palm. Finally, she emerged into moonlight, on the far side of the mountain, miles from the stone circle. Exhausted, she collapsed beneath a hawthorn tree. As she drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed again. This time, she stood on a wind-swept shore. Before her rose the great abbey of Mont Saint-Michel, its spires piercing the clouds. At its base, a figure waited, hooded, cloaked, holding a book, Brother Lucian. He looked up as she approached. "You came," he said, just like Thibault had. "How do you know me?" she asked. "Because I've been writing your story," he replied, opening the book. The pages were blank, except for one line at the bottom. "She who hears the earth will wake the sleeping god." And as she reached for the book, the ground beneath them trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. Far below, something ancient stirred. In the days that followed, Elodie traveled by night, hiding by day. She avoided roads, villages, even solitary farmhouses. She lived on nuts, wild greens, and the last of her dried apples. The raven stayed with her, its presence a silent comfort. Lucien, meanwhile, moved more openly, posing as a pilgrim seeking penance at Mont Saint-Michel. But his path was watched. In Cannes, a merchant noted his interest in old maps. In Avranches, a priest questioned his lack of travel papers. And in the shadows, a man in a black Dominican habit followed, his eyes sharp, his rosary beads clicking like a countdown. Father Gervais had heard rumors of a healer in the Vire Valley, of standing stones that hummed, of a monk who'd vanished with a forbidden text. He believed the end times were near, and that the devil's bride was walking the earth. He would find her, he would burn her, and he would silence the sleeper forever. Elodie reached the coast on the eve of the summer solstice. The tide was out, revealing the causeway to Mont Saint-Michel like a path laid by God himself. She walked it at dawn, the abbey looming above her like a stone crown. At the gate, a nun in a simple gray habit waited. "We've been expecting you," the nun said, her voice calm. "Sister Marguerite sends her thanks." Elodie blinked. "Marguerite? From Sainte Clotilde?" The nun smiled. "She's more than she seemed." "As are you." She led Elodie through winding corridors to a quiet chamber overlooking the sea. There, on a small table, lay a book, identical to the one in her dream, and beside it, a note in Lucien's hand. "I'm being watched. Meet me at the chapel of Saint-Aubert tonight. Come alone. Trust no one." Elodie's hands trembled as she read it. Outside, the tide began to turn, and high in the abbey tower, a bell tolled once, deep, resonant, urgent. The solstice had begun. Somewhere in the crowd of pilgrims entering the gates, a man in black adjusted his hood and smiled. The hunt was nearly over. But the awakening had just begun, of course. Here is the next chapter in Elodie's journey, 3,000 words of deepening mystery, converging paths, and rising stakes. The tone remains calm and immersive, rooted in the textures of the medieval world, and the story deliberately does not conclude, but opens further into wonder, danger, and transformation. The chapel of Saint-Aubert clung to the western edge of Mont Saint-Michel, like a barnacle to a ship's hull, small, ancient and half swallowed by the sea mist that rolled in with the tide. Its stone walls were slick with salt, its wooden door warped from centuries of damp. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax, mildew, and something older, crushed herbs, dried blood, the faint metallic tang of old iron. Elodie arrived just after vespers, cloaked in gray wool borrowed from the nun who'd welcomed her. She'd spent the day restless, pacing the abbey's cloisters, watching the tide creep closer, listening to the chants of monks that seemed to vibrate in her bones. Every shadow felt like a threat, every stranger's glance, a judgment. But when she pushed open the chapel door, it wasn't Father Gervais who stood waiting. It was Lucien. He turned from the altar, his face pale in the candlelight, eyes wide with relief and fear. "You came," he whispered. "I almost didn't," she said, stepping inside. "They're watching the gates." "I know." He closed the distance between them, his hands trembling slightly. "I've been followed since Caen, a Dominican, Gervais. He's not just an inquisitor. He's obsessed. He believes the end of days is coming and that someone, you, is opening a door the church sealed 1,000 years ago." Elodie's breath caught. "The sleeper," Lucien froze. "You know that name?" "I've seen it in dreams and stones, in the eyes of women who aren't there." She hesitated, then pulled the raven stone from her pocket. It pulsed faintly in the dim light. "Who are you really, Brother Lucien?" "Why do you carry a book that writes itself?" He exhaled sharply as if she'd struck him. Then he reached into his robe and withdrew the manuscript, the one he'd found hidden in the scriptorium. He opened it to a blank page. "Watch," he mouthed, and as Elodie stared, words began to appear on the parchment, ink blooming like dark flowers. She stands before him, stone in hand, heart unbroken. The tide rises. The gate stirs. The monk and the healer must choose, silence or song. Lucien closed the book quickly, as if ashamed. "It started after I copied the first page. The text changes. It knows things it shouldn't. And it always leads back to you." Elodie touched the page gently. "It's not just a book. It's a key." "Yes," he said. "But to what?" Before she could answer, a sound echoed from the courtyard. A boot on gravel, too heavy to be a pilgrim. Lucian's face went white. "He's here." He grabbed her hand and pulled her behind the altar into a narrow alcove barely wide enough for two. They pressed close, breaths mingling, hearts hammering in unison. Through a crack in the stone they saw him, Father Gervais, tall and severe in his black habit, a silver crucifix glinting at his chest. He carried no weapon, only a leather-bound ledger and eyes that missed nothing. He stepped into the chapel, scanning slowly. His gaze lingered on the altar, the candles, the floor. Then he knelt and pressed his palm to the stone. "In nomine Patris," he murmured, not in prayer but in testing. The stone beneath his hand darkened, just for a moment, as if absorbing his touch. "He can feel it," Lucian whispered. "The veil." Gervais rose, frowning. He walked to the back of the chapel and ran his fingers along the wall. There, hidden behind a tapestry of Saint Michael slaying the dragon, was a symbol, the same circle with the feather and 7 stars Elodie had seen in her dream. Gervais traced it, then made the sign of the cross, not in blessing, but in warding. "They're closer than I thought," he said aloud, to no one. "The heresy has roots here." He turned and left as silently as he'd come. Only when the courtyard was still did Elodie and Lucienne dare to move. "He knows," she said. "He's known for a while," Lucian replied grimly. "That's why he let me lead him here. He's using me as bait." Elodie looked at him, really looked. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the guilt in the set of his shoulders. "You didn't tell him about me?" "No," he said fiercely. "But I didn't stop him either. I thought, if I could understand the text, I could protect you, or warn you. Or," he broke off, shaking his head. "I don't even know what I believed anymore." She placed a hand on his arm. "You're not alone in this." He met her gaze, and for the first time, something unknotted between them. Not just fear, but trust. Outside, the tide surged against the cliffs, a deep, rhythmic roar that sounded like breathing. "The solstice is tonight," Elodie said softly. "At midnight, the stars align over the stone circle. That's when the gate opens." Lucian's eyes widened. "But the circle is 50 leagues away." "Not the physical circle," she said. "The astral one. Mont Saint-Michel was built on a ley line, a convergence of earth energy. The abbey is a mirror of the stone circle. If the ritual is performed here at the right hour..." "The sleeper wakes," Lucian finished. They both fell silent, the weight of it pressing down. Then, from the corridor, a voice. "You understand more than I expected." Sister Marguerite stepped into the chapel, her gray habit blending with the shadows. But her eyes, sharp, knowing, were anything but humble. "You," Elodie said, stunned. "From Sainte Clotilde." "I never left," Marguerite said simply. "I sent word ahead. I've been part of the sisterhood here for 20 years. My stillbirths. They were daughters, hidden, raised in secret, trained in the old ways." She smiled faintly. "You saved my 7th child, Elodie. The last before the cycle turned." Lucian stared. "You're one of them. We all are," Marguerite said, gesturing to the walls. "The nuns, the monks who still remember, the fishermen who leave offerings in the tide pools. This abbey was built on a pagan shrine. The church thought they could bury it. But you can't drown a river." She stepped closer. "Tonight at midnight, the high tide will flood the crypts beneath the abbey. That's where the original altar stone lies, carved with the same symbol Gervais just touched. If you stand on it, with the book and the stone, and speak the true name of the sleeper..." "What happens?" Lucian asked. "The veil thins," Marguerite said. "Not enough to break it, just enough to listen. And if the sleeper chooses, it may answer." "And if Gervais stops us?" Elodie asked. "Then the gate stays closed," Marguerite said grimly. And the balance tips towards silence. The earth forgets its song, the dreams stop, and the church wins, not with fire, but with forgetting. A bell tolled in the distance. 11 strikes. 1 hour, Lucian said. Marguerite handed Elodie a small vial. "Your mother's amber liquid. We've kept it safe all these years. It will help you here." Then she turned to Lucienne. "You must bring the book. But know this. Once the ritual begins, the text will demand a sacrifice. Not blood, truth. It will ask you to give up something you hold sacred." He swallowed hard. "What if I can't?" "Then the gate remains shut," Marguerite said. "And the sleeper sleeps another 1,000 years." She left them then. vanishing into the mist like a ghost. The crypts were colder than Elodie expected, damp, echoing, lit only by the faint glow of phosphorescent algae on the walls. The tide had already begun to seep in, black water lapping at their ankles as they descended the spiral stairs. Lucien clutched the manuscript to his chest. Elodie held the raven stone and the vial of amber liquid. Neither spoke. The only sound was the slosh of water and the distant groan of the sea against the rock. At the bottom, they found it, a circular chamber, its floor carved from a single slab of granite. In the center, the symbol glowed faintly. Feather, circle, stars. The altar. Lucien breathed. They stepped onto it. The moment Elodie's foot touched the stone, the water around them stilled. The air grew thick, humming with energy. "Now," she said. Lucien opened the book. The pages fluttered as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. Words appeared, not in Latin, but in a language neither of them knew, yet somehow understood. Speak the name that was lost. She who hears the earth, speak. He who writes the truth, witness. Elodie uncorked the vial and drank. Warmth flooded her, not just in her body, but in her mind. Memories surged, her mother whispering to the willow tree, Thibaut standing in the rain, the silver-haired woman in the stone circle. And beneath it all, a presence, vast, ancient, sleeping deep beneath the roots of the world. She closed her eyes, and she spoke, not in words, but in feeling. In longing, in grief and hope and the quiet certainty that she was not alone. The stone beneath her feet began to glow. Above them, the abbey bells rang, not by human hands, but as if the tower itself were singing. In the courtyard, Father Gervais froze, his ledger slipping from his fingers. He looked up at the spire, his face twisted in horror and awe. "It's happening," he whispered. He drew a silver dagger from his belt, not a weapon of war, but of exorcism, and ran toward the crypt entrance. Below, the water rose faster now, swirling around their knees. Lucien watched as the book's pages filled with light. A new line appeared. The monk must choose, faith or truth. He knew what it meant. With shaking hands, he tore a page from his own journal, the one he'd kept hidden beneath his pallet for years. On it, he'd written his deepest secret, that he didn't believe in the God of the church. Not truly. He believed in the God of forests and rivers, of dreams and quiet miracles. He'd become a monk not out of devotion, but out of fear of being different, of being hunted. He placed the page on the altar. "I choose truth," he said. The page dissolved into light. The chamber trembled. From the depths below, a sound rose, not a voice but a resonance, like the lowest note of a cathedral bell felt in the bones. The sleeper wasn't waking. Not yet, but it was, listening. Elodie felt it in her blood, in her breath, in the space between heartbeats. Something ancient turned in its sleep, and for the first time in centuries, it knew they were there. Then, silence. The glow faded. The water stilled. The bell stopped. Had it worked? Before they could wonder, a shout echoed from the stairs. "Blasphemers!" Gervais stood at the entrance, dagger raised, eyes blazing. "You've opened the mouth of hell." He lunged, but Lucien stepped in front of Elodie. "No," he said, voice steady. "We opened a door to something older than your hell, older than your heaven." Gervais hesitated, just for a second, confused by the calm in Lucien's voice. In that moment, the tide surged. A wave of black water crashed into the chamber, knocking Gervais off his feet. The dagger clattered into the dark. Elodie grabbed Lucien's hand. "Run!" They scrambled up the stairs as the crypt filled behind them. Behind, Gervais shouted curses, but the sea drowned his voice. They emerged into the courtyard just as the moon reached its zenith. Full, white, casting silver light over the abbey. And there, standing at the edge of the causeway, was Thibaut. He was soaked, bleeding from a gash on his temple, but alive. "You did it," he said, breathless. "The veil is thin." The sleeper heard. "How did you—" Elodie began. "The raven led me," he said, nodding to the bird perched on the abbey wall. "It never left your side." Gervais stumbled out of the crypt entrance, dripping and furious. But he didn't attack. He simply stared at the moon, at the sea, at the three of them. And for the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. "What have you done?" He whispered. "We remembered," Elodie said. Above them, the stars seemed to shift just slightly, as if realigning, and far below, in the roots of the earth, something breathed. In the days that followed, the abbey buzzed with rumors. Pilgrims spoke of bells ringing with no hands, of tides that rose too high, of a light in the crypts. The abbot ordered prayers for deliverance from diabolical illusions, but the nuns said nothing. They simply left extra candles burning at the shrine of Saint Aubert, and a small bowl of honeycomb at the base of the old yew tree in the garden.
Elodie, Lucien, and Thibault stayed hidden in a fisherman's loft on the mainland, watching the tides, waiting. Gervais did not leave Mont Saint-Michel. He remained in the guest quarters, silent, fasting, staring at the sea. He no longer carried his ledger. What do we do now? Lucien asked one evening, as they shared a loaf of coarse bread. We wait, Thibault said. The sleeper doesn't wake all at once. It stirs in dreams first, in rivers, in the roots of trees, in the hearts of those who listen. Elodie looked out at the water, where the moon's reflection shimmered like a path. It's not over, is it? No, Thibault said gently. It's just beginning. That night, Elodie dreamed again. But this time, she wasn't alone in the forest. A figure walked beside her, tall, cloaked, face still hidden. But when they reached the clearing, the figure turned. It was her mother. You did well, my daughter, she said, smiling. But the gate is only open a crack. The rest is up to you. Then she faded, leaving behind a single white feather. Elodie woke with tears on her cheeks, and the feather resting on her chest. Outside, the raven called once, sharp and clear, and far to the east, in a village no one marked on maps, a child was born with a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. The threads were weaving, the sleeper was dreaming, and the world held its breath. Of course, here's the next chapter in Elodie's journey. 3,000 words of deepening mystery, converging destinies, and the quiet hum of an ancient world stirring beneath the surface. The story continues in the same calm, immersive tone, rooted in historical texture and emotional truth, and remains deliberately open-ended, pulsing with possibility rather than resolution. The feather did not vanish by morning. Elodie kept it tucked inside the leather pouch with her mother's linen square and the raven stone. It felt warm against her skin, as if it carried a slow, steady heartbeat. She didn't speak of the dream, not even to Lucien, who now slept on a pallet by the hearth, his brow furrowed even in sleep, the manuscript resting like a child in the crook of his arm. They had been in the fisherman's loft for 5 days. Rain lashed the thatched roof, and the wind howled through the salt-crusted shutters. Below, the village of Genets clung to the marshy coast, its people wary of strangers, especially those who smelled the sea mist and secrets. But the old fisherman Etienne asked no questions. He'd lost 3 sons to the plague and a wife to fever. He knew grief when he saw it. In return for mending nets and tending his herb garden, he gave them bread, silence, and a view of the bay where the tide still sang. It was on the 6th morning that the child arrived, not with fanfare, but with a knock so soft Elodie almost missed it over the drumming rain. She opened the door to find a girl of no more than 8, barefoot and drenched, clutching a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her eyes, wide, dark, and startlingly calm, locked onto Elodie's. "You're the healer," the girl said. "Not a question. I tend to those in need," Elodie replied carefully. The girl stepped forward and unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a small clay doll, crudely shaped, its surface etched with spirals and moons. Around its neck hung a thread of red wool, and tied to that, a single white feather identical to the one Elodie now carried. "My name is Celine," the girl said. "I was born under the blood moon. My mother says I'm the seventh daughter of a seventh daughter. She says you'll know what that means." Elodie's breath caught. The old lineage, the unbroken line. "Where is your mother?" she asked. "Gone," Celine said simply. "The fever took her 3 nights past. Before she died, she made me promise to find you. She said the sleeper dreams of me now, and that I must learn to listen before the next tide turns." Behind her, Lucien stirred. He came to the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes, then froze when he saw the doll. "That symbol," he murmured. "It's in the manuscript. The mark of the awakened." Celine looked at him. "You're the scribe, the one who writes what the earth forgets." Lucien paled. "How do you—" "The stones told me," she said, as if it were obvious. Thibault, who had been mending a tear in his cloak by the fire, finally spoke. "She's one of us, or will be." He knelt before Celine. "Do you know why your mother sent you?" The girl nodded. "Because the gate is open, and someone must guard it while it breathes." Elodie felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the damp. This child, so small, so certain, carried the same quiet authority as the silver-haired woman in the stone circle, the same unshakable knowing. She took Celine's hand. "You'll stay with us." That afternoon, as the rain eased to a drizzle, Lucien sat with the manuscript open on his lap, Celine beside him, peering at the pages with unnerving focus. "It's not just writing itself," she said suddenly. "It's remembering. The book is a vessel, like the stones, like the river." Lucien stared at her. "Can you read it?" "No," she said, "but I can hear it. When you turn the page, it hums, like a bee in a jar." He flipped to a blank section. Sure enough, a low vibration filled the air, so faint only someone listening with their whole body could detect it. Elodie watched from the window. The raven perched on the sill beside her. It had not left since Celine's arrival, as if recognizing a kindred spirit. "She's the next thread," Thibault said quietly, joining her. "The cycle continues." "But she's a child," Elodie said, voice tight with worry. "How can she bear this?" "Children bear more than we think," Thibault replied, "especially when the world needs them to." It was not human, not animal. It was old, older than stone, older than stars. And in its gaze, Elodie saw not malice, but sorrow, a deep, ancient loneliness. "You are late." It seemed to say not in words, but in feeling. Asterisk, but not too late. Asterisk. Then the chamber filled with water, cold and black, and Elodie woke gasping. Beside her, Celine sat upright, eyes wide open, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You saw it too," Elodie whispered. The girl nodded. "It's sad. It's been alone so long." The next morning, a rider came. Not Gervais, though his shadow still lingered over Mont Saint-Michel, but a messenger from Avranches, bearing a sealed letter for the scribe who fled St. Martin. Lucien broke the wax with trembling fingers. The message was brief. Asterisk, brother Lucien. The abbot is dead, found in a cell with no mark upon him, yet his face frozen in terror. The manuscript you took is now declared heretical. Burn it, or be declared an apostate. Prior Loy asterisk. Lucien crumpled the letter. "They think I killed him." "You didn't," Elodie said firmly. "But the book." He looked at Celine, who was braiding reeds by the fire. "What if it's dangerous? What if it's using us?" "It's not using us," Celine said without looking up. "It's waking us. There's a difference." Thibault placed a hand on Lucien's shoulder. "The church fears what it cannot control. That doesn't make the truth evil." But doubt had taken root. That evening, Lucien walked down to the shore alone, the manuscript tucked under his arm. Elodie followed at a distance. She watched as he knelt in the wet sand, opened the book, and held a taper to its edge. The flame touched the page and went out. He tried again, and again. Each time, the fire died as if smothered by invisible hands. Finally, he sat back, defeated. "It won't let me." From the dunes, Elodie stepped forward. "Because it's not yours to destroy." He looked up at her, eyes glistening. I'm afraid, Elodie. What if we're wrong? What if this is heresy? What if it's holiness the church forgot? She countered gently. Your God is in the cathedral. Mine is in the roots. Maybe they're the same voice, just speaking different languages. He didn't answer, but he closed the book and stood. And when they walked back to the loft, he carried it like a sacred thing. 2 nights later, the raven led them inland. It flew in circles above the loft at dusk, then darted toward the marshes, calling insistently. Celine was the first to understand. It's showing us the way, she said, to the standing stones. But they're days away, Lucien protested. The veil is thin, Celine replied. Time bends near the gate. And so they went, Elodie, Lucien, Thibault, and the child, following the raven through reed beds and willow thickets, guided by moonlight and the pull in their bones. They walked all night, and yet by dawn they stood at the edge of the stone circle. It was unchanged, and yet everything had changed. The stones glowed faintly, humming with the same resonance Elodie had felt in the crypt. The air smelled of ozone and wet earth. And in the center, the altar stone bore a new carving. The crescent moon, the feather, and now a child's handprint. Celine walked forward without hesitation. She placed her palm over the print. The ground trembled. From the stones, the shimmering figures returned. The keepers. But this time, they bowed to Celine. She is the bridge, the silver-haired woman said, her voice echoing in Elodie's mind. The sleeper dreams through her now, but the dream is fragile. It needs anchors, 3 points to hold the veil open. She turned to Elodie, Lucien, and Thibault. You are the anchors, one of earth, one of word, one of memory. You must each make a binding. How? Thibault asked. By giving what you hold most dear. Elodie thought of her mother's linen square, Lucien of his faith, Thibault of his freedom. That night, the dream returned, but it was different. Elodie stood not in the forest, but in a vast underground chamber, its walls lined with roots that pulsed like veins. In the center lay a figure wrapped in moss and silver bark, face hidden, breath slow as tectonic shift. The sleeper, and kneeling beside it was Celine, her small hands pressed to the earth, singing a wordless lullaby. Elodie tried to speak, to warn her, but no sound came. Instead, the sleeper turned his head just slightly and opened one eye. But before they could decide, a horn sounded in the distance. Gervais. He had not given up. He's brought soldiers, Lucien said grimly, peering through the trees. 12 men, and chains. They'll burn the stones, Thibault said. Salt the earth. Celine looked at them, calm as ever. Then we must bind quickly. She turned to Elodie. You must give your hands. Elodie's breath hitched. My hands. To heal is to touch the veil. Your hands are conduits. You must mark them, not with blood, but with ash from the sacred fire. Celine knelt and drew a symbol on Elodie's palms, the feather within the circle. As she did, warmth spread through Elodie's arms, and she felt the pulse of every root, every stream, every heartbeat in the forest. Then Celine turned to Lucien. You must give your voice. My voice. The book speaks through you, but to anchor the veil, you must speak without it. You must vow, aloud, to carry the truth even when it is no words. Lucien swallowed. Then, standing tall, he said, I vow to remember what the world forgets, to write not with ink, but with breath, to be the scribe of silence. The air shimmered around him. Finally, Celine faced Thibault. You must give your path. He understood at once. I can never stop running. You must stay, she said softly. Guard this place. Be the keeper of the stones. Thibault closed his eyes. For a man who had spent his life in motion, the idea of stillness was a kind of death. But he nodded. I will stay. As he spoke, the raven landed on his shoulder and did not fly away. The binding was complete. Above them, the clouds parted, the stars aligned, and deep below, the sleeper sighed. But Gervais was closer now. Torches flickered between the trees. We have to go, Lucien urged. Celine shook her head. Not all of us. The child must remain hidden. But the scribe and the healer must walk the wider world. The veil is open in many places now, not just here. She pressed the clay doll into Elodie's hands. Take this. Wherever you go, bury it in the earth. It will grow into a marker. Others will find it. Others like me. Then she turned to Lucian. Write the story. Not just of us, but of all who listen. Elodie knelt and hugged the girl tightly. Will I see you again? Celine smiled. In every dream. In every stone. In every child born under a blood moon. Thibaut placed a hand on Elodie's shoulder. Go, while there's still time. As they slipped into the forest, Elodie looked back one last time. Celine stood in the center of the circle, small but unshaken, the raven on her shoulder, the stones glowing around her like guardians. And in the distance, Gervais and his men crashed through the underbrush, shouting in Latin, crosses held high, but they would find no heretics, only an empty circle, and the wind whispering in a language they could not understand. Weeks later, in a village near Tours, a traveling healer and a quiet monk took rooms above a baker's shop. The healer mended broken bones and eased childbirth pains. The monk copied texts for the local priest, but in the margins he wrote other things. Poems about rivers, notes on the phases of the moon, sketches of feathers and stones. No one knew their names. No one suspected their past. But sometimes, late at night, the baker's daughter would hear them talking in low voices, and the air in the street would hum, just for a moment, like a plucked string. And in the garden behind the shop, a small clay doll sat half buried in the soil. Already, green shoots curled around its base. Far away, in the marshes of Genets, a new standing stone rose from the earth, smooth, dark, veined with white. And beneath the roots of the world, the sleeper dreamed on, not of destruction, but of reunion. The threads were weaving. The story was not over. It was only just beginning to be told. Of course, here is a gentle, resonant conclusion to Elodie's story, honoring the mystery, the history, and the quiet courage of those who listen to the earth. It closes the arc with warmth, wisdom, and a sense of enduring legacy, without undoing the magic you've so carefully built. Years passed, as years do, quietly, relentlessly, like tides shaping stone. Elodie never returned to St. Clotilde, but she never truly left it, either. She carried the mist of the Vire River in her bones, the scent of willow bark in her hands, the echo of her mother's voice in every remedy she brewed. She and Lucian traveled not as lovers, nor as fugitives, but as companions bound by something deeper than vows, a shared witness to the world's hidden pulse. They settled, eventually, in a sun-drenched village in the foothills of the Pyrenees, where the mountains cradle the sky and the old ways still whispered through olive groves and hidden springs. There, Elodie opened a small herb garden, not a clinic, not a sanctuary, but a place where women came to sit, to speak, to learn which roots ease labor pains, which flowers calm nightmares, which songs coax bees from their hives. Lucian, for his part, became the village scribe, but his true work happened after dusk. In a room lined with shelves of dried lavender and bundles of sage, he filled codex after codex not with scripture, but with stories of healers, dreamers, midwives, and moon watchers. He called it the Book of Listening. He never published it. He didn't need to. He read it aloud to children by firelight, and they carried its words into their dreams. Celine was never seen again in the north, but her presence rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. In villages across France, girls born under blood moons were given white feathers at their naming. Clay dolls with crescent marks appeared in garden beds, riverbanks, and forest clearings. Travelers spoke of a child who could calm storms with a song or make barren trees bloom with a touch, but no one could say where she lived. Perhaps she was everywhere. Perhaps she was the land itself, waking. Thibaut kept his vow. He remained at the stone circle, becoming as much a part of it as the moss and lichen. Pilgrims sometimes found him there, gray-bearded, barefoot, eyes bright with quiet knowing, offering water to weary wanderers and pointing silently to the stars. When he died, on a night when the moon hung low and full, the villagers buried him beneath the central altar stone. By morning, a white-flowered vine had grown over his grave, though no one had planted it. As for Father Gervais, he never found the heretics he sought. But something changed in him after that night at Mont Saint-Michel. He stopped hunting. Instead, he began collecting folk remedies, recording midwives' songs, even preserving fragments of old prayers to forgotten saints. On his deathbed, he confessed to a novice, "I thought I was fighting the devil, but perhaps I was only afraid of a God too wild for my cathedral." The church, of course, moved on. It built higher walls, wrote stricter laws, declared more sins. But it could not silence the hum in the earth, nor the dreams that came on solstice nights, nor the way a mother's hand, warm on a fevered brow, could feel like grace. Elodie lived to a ripe old age. Her hair turned silver, her hands gnarled like roots, but her eyes never lost their storm-gray clarity. On her last evening, she sat in her garden as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Lucien, now stooped and slow, brought her a cup of chamomile steeped with single white petal. "Do you hear it?" she asked softly. He listened, beyond the crickets, beyond the wind in the cypress trees. He heard it, a low, steady thrum, like a heartbeat beneath the soil. "Yes," he said. She smiled. "It's still dreaming." And as the stars blinked awake above them, Elodie closed her eyes, not in fear, not in sorrow, but in recognition. She had not saved the world. She had simply remembered how to listen to it. When she was gone, they buried her beneath the oldest olive tree, with a clay doll at her feet and a raven's feather on her chest. And every year on the summer solstice, the villagers gathered there to sing, not hymns, but old songs of earth and tide, of women who walked with stones, of monks who wrote with moonlight, of children who dreamed the world awake. The story is over.